Greetings, class. The next question on our list is, what is nonviolence and why is it so effective? So to start, I want to give you one of our textbook definitions of nonviolence. Nonviolence is the use of peaceful means, not force, to bring about political or social change. This may be what we're thinking about with nonviolent protest, but most specifically, nonviolence as a type of force, right? It's not passive, it's not apathetic, it is actually the intentional and strategic use of resistance of nonviolent means. This means things like what we see with Gandhi and the Salt March and preparing the fellow protesters to take strikes from batons upon the head, but not to respond in anger and not to respond violently. This is what we see when we see Martin Luther King Jr. and the protests in the South where dogs were used to they'd sick the dogs on the protesters, and they'd turn the fire hoses and they would physically beat the protesters as a way of trying to suppress them. And the protesters did not respond in kind. They did not use violence. They did not use anger. They didn't use this type of force. So it's the strategic use of principle. And that's kind of hard to articulate, right? If you're protesting for equality against an oppressor who's willing to use violence, right? And you're being strategic. Martin Luther King Jr. knows that if violence is visited upon the protesters and they respond back and violently, that the protesters' violence will be used as the justification for the violence that was initially used. And so it's a strategic tool for making a message using principle as a means of speaking to power and to create change. The question here is, and let me say, it's not just an inference that I'm making here. If you look at research from 1900 to 2015, nonviolent campaigns succeed 51% of the time, right? And in that same period of time, violent campaigns have only succeeded 27% of the time, right? So it's not just an observation that's being made. Nonviolence is not guaranteed to deliver the outcome, nor is violence guaranteed to deliver the outcome. But nonviolence is actually more effective, right? It has led to the positive change or to the revolutionary change or to the improved outcomes at a higher rate than the alternative use of violence has been able to deliver that. Right? So it's a measured, it's a known detail, but the question here isn't, can you prove that nonviolence is better? It's actually to articulate the conditions and the reasons for the success of nonviolence. Why is it successful? And so one of the things that I want to make sure that I deliver is that there's a risk factor. When you engage in conflict of any variety, entering into that conflict does come with opportunity cost. If nothing else, it's your time and energy. If you put time and energy into something and you don't get what you want, you're worse off than if you hadn't gone after it at all, right? But so reducing the risk factor, that is to say, what's at stake? What could get hurt? How bad could you get hurt if you tried to do this? Right. So the risk factor of, let's see, I've got some protest signs handy. So if I want to support something I believe in, and say go to my local congressman's office and hold this sign, I support Planned Parenthood, right? Sign is nonviolent. I'm not physically confronting in any sort of threatening fashion my representative. So if I hold the sign and it says I support Planned Parenthood, and I feel like the person that I'm protesting against or to the person I'm trying to deliver the message to has not been supportive of my cause. If I don't get what I want, so I've lost the time and the energy, the cost of making the sign. Maybe the sign gets confiscated. Maybe I lose it. Maybe I maybe that's something that I could have done something better with my time that day. But if I decide that I want to use violence to try to achieve the message, then what's the risk, right? There's a significant difference between going to a Capitol building or an office building with a sign versus taking, say, a firearm to say, I'm going to force you to do what I want. Um, so the risk is much lower. We need to be very clear about that up front. But strategically, we have another detail that we need to reflect on, which is that when we use nonviolence, we get people to listen to us, right? So um, I don't want to say it's necessarily calling in. Like if you disagree with somebody and you're friendly, that doesn't necessarily mean that you will get them. But getting someone to listen to you is a good first step, right? Um, Hearing your concerns is better than having them dismiss you outright. And using violence is a good way to make sure that people ignore your concerns and think about the threat. Um, and so the sign may be read if I'm being courteous and sensitive and thoughtful. But there's no guarantee that the sign's going to work. But there's less guarantee that bringing a gun to somebody's workplace is going to work, right? I mean, that's offensive. It's threatening, and threats repel people. Um, Nonviolence does less to repel people. It might give people the pause to listen to the message. Um, but so the other part of the strategic detail here is that in your messaging, you have to have a clear ask, a clear request, and so forth, right? So people can nonviolently protest but not know what they're asking for. So again, there's no guarantee that it works. But reducing the risk, reducing the threat of being hurt in reaction is part of the success. But another part of the success is that in this endeavor, the person is humanized, right? You look like an agent of love and care and someone we should be sympathetic to or curious about when you deliver your message in a way that's less threatening and less offensive. Um, but the other detail is that it's harder to describe that violence is also difficult. Um, it shouldn't be taken for granted that when when protesters confront a power that's potentially being illegitimate use of in their use of force, that the people who are working or serving that individual um, don't want to harm their neighbors or their colleagues or their friends or the people that they see every day. And so when you're being nonviolent, when you're being civil, it makes it psychologically significantly more difficult to be violent and forceful against those people. I mean, this is a psychological challenge, right? People have written about this after the fact. Police officers have suffered from PTSD from having mazed protesters, right? During the Occupy movement, there was a police officer who ended up suing the city because he followed his orders in macing some protesters, but like living with the consequences of that was very difficult for him, right? He suffered from disabilities in the course of his duties of delivering harms to people, right? It's hard to do. Um, and so if you make it easier for people to be violent against you, you lose some of that advantage, right? And so one of the things that students frequently ask, well, how does nonviolence work against people who are willing to use violence? And I say, well, can you give an example? And one of the common examples that gets given is the example of the Nazis and their use of violence during World War II the Holocaust, the genocide of the last century. And I say, well, so nonviolence worked very effectively, in fact, against Nazis. It just didn't work, at every level all the time. But there were many communities that decided to nonviolently resist the occupation and the demands of the Nazi regime. And this included people who defended their neighbors and their friends who were, say, who were intermarried, right? Like that if one of the spouses was Jewish, um, that the partner would stick up for them, but also all of the neighbors would refuse to let Nazis take those people away. And so the protest on Rosenstraat Street is a great demonstration um, people rallying, right? They didn't use physical force to prevent um, the people from being captured. They used a moral power to interrupt the internment of the people that they loved, cared about, knew, that they lived with. And so it worked, right? They were actually able to prevent many atrocities by being able to just morally oppose it by saying, we don't support this and we will refuse. And and it leads to the imperative of, if you're going to take them, you're going to have to take all of us. And they frequently didn't want to take all of them because them included the individuals that they thought that were part of their superior race to begin with. Um, so it was a kind of social jujitsu. Uh, and it used moral power to force those in power, the oppressors, to see the legitimacy of the victims in a different light. And so this is what tends to happen. You see the humanity of people sometimes most in their suffering. When others suffer as you do, you see their humanity, and it's very hard, psychologically speaking, to visit harm upon other humans. Frequently, when it gets carried out, people want to carry it out in a fashion that showcases their willingness to embody and embrace justice. Like punishing a wrongdoer is one of those occasions where people feel morally justified in visiting harm upon another. So using nonviolence takes away that opportunity to inspire the retributive response. Um, but the other part there again is that it calls people in. Nonviolence is a way to bring other people into your fold, to make them sensitive and engaged with your movement. It's not the idea that it's in avoiding injury. In fact, nonviolent protesters frequently are encouraging or inviting the violence to be upon them. But it's what energizes the injustice that they're confronting, right? It does the both and. It confronts the injustice and it also exposes it. And when we expose injustice, then more people are likely to become sympathetic with the impacts of the injustice. And when more people are sensitive to what's happening, especially when it's wrong, they're more likely to rally behind that cause instead of opposing it. Um, Again, nonviolence is not guaranteed to work, nor is violence guaranteed to work. Empirical evidence suggests and showcases that in the last century, nonviolence has actually been more effective in delivering positive change than violent revolutions have been. And I've tried to lay out some of the thinking about why that ends up being the case. See you in the next one.